Hello chaps, blondbassist. If I was on a tropical island and was given a choice of just one console to play for the rest of time, after having owned one for a few months now, my console of choice, without question, is the original PlayStation 3. Some of you may remember that the first model of the PS3 could not only play PS1 game discs, but it could also play PS2 game discs as well. This was accomplished by having PS2 hardware built onto the motherboard. But did you know that depending on which region you purchased your console from on launch, it could either be fully or partially backwards compatible? If you lived in America, you had access to the superior model that had both the PS2 CPU and GPU. If you were a Euro peasant, you only had access to the partially compatible model that had just the PS2 GPU. Most games tend to work fine on the European models, but a percentage of games had issues, with a handful not even booting at all. By mid-2008, just a year and a half after launch, hardware-based PS2 back compat was completely removed from all subsequent console revisions. Cut! I've wanted to acquire an American model for a while for the full compatibility, but due to them becoming rare in the States, they were already pretty expensive, and that's before you factor in import taxes. So after some research, I discovered that a particular model of the PS3 debugging kit, specifically the DECH-A00A unit, under the hood was in fact identical to the American retail model. After comparing prices of both the retail console and the debugging kit, the debug console worked out a little bit cheaper. So the debug console looks almost identical to the retail model, with the only obvious difference being that it says test under the logo. From an aesthetic perspective, this is my favourite looking console, and I really like how they integrated the card readers into the case design. Very cool.
It's very nice.
What debugging stations were used for is when a game developer wants to test their game on retail hardware, they would use a debug kit. Using the debugging features would allow them to pull information off the console if the software crashes, to help them find and fix issues. So what can you actually do with a test kit? Well, out of the box you can play PS1, 2 and 3 games off of a disc, and use it pretty much like a retail model, just without the ability to play music and films or connect to the PlayStation network. The real meat and potatoes is in the debug menu. And whilst there are a ton of options, most of this stuff will only be useful to developers. But there are two cool features that I found to be quite handy. Anybody who's tried to record footage off of a PS3 will know how much of a pain in the ass HDCP is. Well, every day is Christmas Day with a debug kit, because now you can turn that right off. The second is the ability to impersonate the owner of a save game. This is useful as it circumvents the save game copy protection mechanisms, which, at this point in the console's life cycle, serve little more than to just piss you off. Whilst the standard Sony debug firmware is nice, the real potential of the machine is unlocked when you install custom firmware. If you're familiar with the PS3 hacking scene, you'll remember the infamous GeoHot PS3 jailbreak on firmware version 3.55, allowing you to install custom firmware over the top of official firmware. Before we proceed, I need to stress that official firmware and debug firmware are two different things. If you try to install retail firmware on a debug console or vice versa, you will brick your machine. So if you are going to attempt modifying your console, make sure you are using the correct firmware type for your system. Firstly, you will need to download 3 programs. One is Rebug Toolbox, the second is called Multiman, and the final program is called Webman, which I'll put links to in the description. Assuming the system is already on 3.55 debug, installing custom firmware is a very simple process. Once you have your chosen flavour of custom firmware, in this case we'll be using the latest debug version of Rebug custom firmware called DREX 4.82.1. Once you have your custom firmware downloaded using your PC, rename your firmware update file to ps3updat.pup in all caps. Stick it in a folder named PS3 on the root of a FAT32 formatted USB stick. Then finally add the 3 programs we downloaded earlier to the root of the drive. Plug the USB stick into your PS3, then install the custom firmware just like a regular update. the update has finished installing, you will be dumped back onto the XMB. From there, scroll down to Package Manager and install the 3 programs we transferred onto the USB stick earlier. Once that is done, first you will need to launch Rebug Toolbox and configure the selector section to the same way as I have it on screen now. Finally, run the Webman updater, which will cause the screen to fade to black, then reboot the console. Once the machine is rebooted, Webman should now be installed, and now we can start delving into what we can do with our newfound freedom.
It's freedom time! America, no!
Using the program called Multiman, we can rip the contents of our disc to the hard drive, allowing them to be played directly from it, without the need of having a disc in the tray. This cuts down on wear and tear on your components and saves you the arduous task of getting out of your seat to change discs. By ripping game discs into ISOs, it allows us to launch games directly from the XMB, thanks to the Webman mod we installed earlier. Selecting the game from the list will mount the ISO, which basically tricks the PS3 into thinking the disc is in the tray. Not only can you rip PS3 games, but you can also rip PS2 titles as well, using the same process. But before you launch a PS2 game, go back to the XMB and navigate across to the Settings tab. Scroll down to Game Settings and make sure that the PS/PS2 upscaler is set to normal or full screen. This will enable the RSX to upscale PS1 and 2 games up to a maximum resolution of 1080p, making them look a lot better. I would recommend using the full screen mode, as many PS2 games offer 16:9 support in their options menu. But don't worry if your game doesn't support it, as you can change your setting whilst in game. The second option, called Smoothing, applies a filter over the image to make jaggies less noticeable. I disable it mainly because of recording, but it can look quite nice. This can also be toggled whilst in game. Something neat I discovered a few months ago is that the Ethernet port on the Debug kit is also recognised by the PS2 emulator, allowing for system link over a local network. Being able to play LAN games on PS2s with native HDMI is cool, but what about going online? Sadly, the PS2's online services were taken down a long time ago, but a few clever chaps found a way to re-enable online play for certain games. So how you do this is you'll need a network setup disk or download an ISO of it, launch it, then do an advanced setup. Manually set your local IP settings for your console, then set the primary DNS server IP address. For this, there is a public Google document that has the relevant DNS IP, which I will leave a link to in the description. Bear in mind, not all games are supported using this method. You can find a list of supported games in the same Google document that has DNS IP. Once that is all complete, quit the network disk and launch the game. In this case, Star Wars Battlefront 2. Connect online using the profile we just created and enjoy all the fragging in 480i. Yeah! Oh. Which highlights the other challenge. PS2 online play wasn't that mainstream in its prime, and considering the hoops you have to go through now, along with the fact it's an almost 20-year-old console, it's a little niche, I gotta say. So the player base seems to be practically zero. But I have read about some Facebook groups that organise play events, so if you really want to play PS2 games online, that or X-Link Kai will probably be your best bet. Something else worth mentioning is that Sony made the hard drive user upgradable on every retail PS3. And that is still the same for the test kits, so if you do get this particular model, you will want to upgrade the 60GB drive straight away, and the process is pretty simple. An important thing to note as well is that there are a few different kinds of debug kits. The model I'm using in this video is the only model that has PS2 hardware, and if you just want the debug firmware features and you don't care about what the case looks like or playing PS2 games, a cost-effective option would be to buy a retail console on 3.55, then using custom firmware you can convert it into a debug kit, which I haven't tried personally, but I know it can be done, providing you're willing to take the risk. So, would I recommend getting one? If it's not a DECHA model, don't bother. Otherwise, well, it depends. As a YouTuber, being able to record PS1, 2 and 3 games on a single device, all over HDMI, in addition to being able to play games off the internal drive, is really nice. But I still probably would have bought one anyway, even if I wasn't making videos, because the value proposition is really strong. But you'll just have to decide yourself if all of this stuff is worth it. So if this sort of thing interests you, let me know in the comments and I might make some more videos about it. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video and subscribe if you want to see more. Check check out the links in the description, and I'll see you in the next one. Take it easy, chaps. I want to say a quick thanks to a chap called Lagoonin. He's been a Patreon subscriber for just over 3 months now, and he's been very active on the Patreon feed when I've been posting early video concepts and ideas, giving lots of feedback and that sort of stuff. So just want to say thanks, Lagoonin. Very much appreciate it, mate. Thanks for watching this far, and I'll see you in the next video. Take it easy, chaps.